Right now, Linux is running on more home computers than at any point in its 30-year history. Global desktop share crossed 4.7% in 2025. The United States passed 5% for the first time ever in June of that year, and current growth trajectories put the global number near 6% before the end of 2026. That is not a rounding error anymore. That is tens of millions of machines that used to boot into Windows and now do not. And here's the part that never makes the headline. A meaningful chunk of the people who made that switch this year have already reinstalled Windows on the exact same laptop. Scroll through any tech forum, and you will find a triumphant "I'm never going back" post from January sitting right next to a quieter "Okay, I'm back on Windows, here's why" post from April. Both groups are real. Both groups have legitimate reasons. And the split between them is not random. It follows a pattern that is almost perfectly predictable once you know what to look for. That is what this video is actually about. Not Linux is better or Windows is better, but exactly who is staying on Linux for good. Exactly who keeps crawling back to Windows within a few months, and why. Stick around for the checklist near the end, because it will save you a wasted weekend either way. Start with the scale of what is actually happening, because the numbers tell you more than the arguments do. Linux distribution market share worldwide reached 4.7% in 2025, up roughly 70% from where it sat just 3 years earlier. India alone shows an adoption rate north of 16%. The highest of any major economy, largely thanks to government and education initiatives built around open source software. The Steam hardware survey, which only counts gamers, put Linux at around 3% in late 2025, a number that sounds small until you remember that a few years ago it barely registered at all. None of this is happening only at the consumer level either. Switzerland committed more than $200 million to a national cloud service built on open source infrastructure and passed legislation requiring government software to be released as open source by default. The European Union has floated the idea of a shared EU Linux platform for public administrations across member states, and the United States Digital Analytics Program separately recorded that around 6% of visitors to federal government websites were running Linux as of August 2025. A strange but telling data point given that the people behind those visits are ordinary citizens and government employees rather than a self-selected crowd of tech enthusiasts. When governments start hedging their bets on the same operating system that ordinary frustrated users are downloading at home, that tells you the shift is structural, not just a passing trend on Reddit. So why are this many people leaving Windows in the first place? Two forces are doing most of the work, and they are very different in nature. The first is hardware, and it is the less emotional of the two. Windows 10 reached its official end of support in October of 2025, and Windows 11's requirements, specifically a TPM 2.0 security chip and a fairly recent processor, locked out an enormous number of otherwise perfectly functional computers. Estimates of how many machines fall into that excluded category run into the hundreds of millions worldwide. Owners of those machines faced a real choice. Buy a new computer they did not actually need, keep running an unsupported operating system with no further security patches, or try something else. For a huge number of them, something else meant putting Linux Mint or Zorin OS onto hardware that was about to become e-waste for no reason other than a missing chip. That single policy decision, more than any marketing campaign Linux has ever run, is probably the single biggest driver of new installs in 2025 and 2026. The second force is behavioral rather than hardware-based, and it is the slower burning one. Setting up a new Windows 11 PC today means creating or signing into a Microsoft account before you can do much of anything, since the local account workarounds that used to let people skip that step have been patched out build after build. Once you are in, the operating system nudges you constantly toward Edge as your browser, even after you have deliberately picked something else, toward OneDrive and Microsoft 365 subscriptions, toward Copilot, which by 2026 had become so aggressively woven into the interface that Microsoft's own Windows leadership publicly admitted the rollout had gone further than users wanted. Recall the AI feature that screenshots your screen every few seconds and makes the history searchable, eventually shipped as opt-in rather than on by default. But the fact that an opt-out screenshot system was ever the default plan for a mainstream consumer operating system told a lot of longtime Windows users everything they needed to know about where the product was heading. Add an advertising identifier turned on by default, promoted apps sitting inside the start menu, and default browser settings that have a habit of quietly resetting themselves after major updates, and you get a steady drip of small irritations that, for a growing number of people, eventually adds up to "I'm done." There is also a pattern running underneath all of this that longtime Windows watchers recognize immediately. Microsoft ships a feature in an aggressive default state. The backlash gets loud enough to make headlines. Microsoft walks it back to opt in and adds a few safeguards. And a few builds later, pieces of the same capability quietly resurface somewhere else in the interface. Recall followed that arc almost exactly. Announced as an always-on photographic memory for the PC, exposed by security researchers, as storing screenshots in plain, unencrypted text, delayed and rebuilt with biometric authentication and exclusions for things like banking pages, then finally shipped as opt-in rather than mandatory. The fix was real. So was the direction of travel. By 2026, that same dynamic had earned its own nickname inside the Windows community. People started calling the steady avalanche of AI features stuffed into every corner of the interface microslop, a blunt little term that stuck because it captured something real, namely that Copilot kept expanding into menus, taskbars, and settings panels faster than most users had actually asked for. Microsoft's own Windows leadership eventually acknowledged in public that the push had created genuine pain points. For a specific kind of longtime user, that acknowledgement landed less like reassurance and more like confirmation that they had been right to start looking elsewhere. Here's what is different about 2026 compared to every previous year of the Linux desktop that never actually arrived. The software finally got good enough to absorb that frustration, instead of just attracting curious tourists who bounce off within a week. Valve's Proton compatibility layer, originally built to let the Steam Deck handle Windows games, has matured to the point that a large share of single-player and older multiplayer titles run on Linux at performance. Levels close to native Windows, sometimes even slightly ahead, partly because Linux carries less background overhead competing for the same CPU cycles. Wi-Fi, audio, and basic peripheral support that used to require manual driver hunting now mostly just works out of the box on mainstream distributions like Mint, Ubuntu, and Fedora. Desktop environments such as KDE Plasma can be configured to look and behave almost exactly like Windows, which strips away a huge chunk of the learning curve fear that used to scare casual users off entirely. The Steam Deck itself deserves real credit here, since it quietly turned millions of people into comfortable Linux users without ever telling them that is what was happening. The people who try Linux under these conditions and actually stick with it tend to share a recognizable profile. They are doing ordinary computing, browsing, email, streaming, Office documents, casual or older games, rather than depending on one specific piece of specialized software that only exists on Windows. A large number of them are running hardware Microsoft just orphaned, so there is no real going back option unless they are willing to buy a new machine they were not planning to buy. And many of them were already irritated by the account requirements, the ads, and the telemetry, so the absence of all of that on Linux feels like relief rather than a downgrade. For this group, the switch is not really an experiment anymore. It is closer to a permanent move, the same way someone who got fed up with a noisy apartment does not move back just because the new place takes a week to unpack and a few boxes are still on the floor. Now, for the group that goes back, and the single biggest reason has a name, most casual switchers never expect to run into anti-cheat software. A huge share of competitive multiplayer games, including titles built around Riot's Vanguard system and a long list of others, rely on kernel-level anti-cheat tools like Easy Anti-Cheat, BattleEye, and Anti-Cheat Expert. These systems work by burying themselves deep inside the operating system to watch for cheating tools, and that design is fundamentally at odds with how Linux is built. A Riot security engineer explained the logic plainly a couple of years back. Linux lets a user freely tinker with the kernel itself with no reliable way to prove the system has not been tampered with, which is exactly the kind of open environment a cheat developer would love and an anti-cheat team simply cannot trust. Community-run tracking sites that catalog exactly which anti-cheat protected games work on Linux through Proton currently list more than 1,100 titles requiring some form of anti-cheat software, and well over half of them, somewhere around 680 remain unplayable even when the underlying game engine runs perfectly fine on its own. The breakage is not always permanent, and it is not always predictable either. In one widely discussed case in late 2025, a popular online role-playing game that had run fine on Linux for months suddenly stopped working overnight when a routine patch switched on a new kernel-level anti-cheat system. In Linux, players were left waiting on a fix that, by the developer's own admission, was never coming because the anti-cheat vendor had no plans to support the platform at all. Players who buy a Steam Deck or wipe their gaming PC, expecting to keep playing their main competitive title, routinely discover, sometimes mid-season, that the anti-cheat layer simply refuses to initialize, or worse, that a routine patch silently introduces a new anti-cheat system and breaks something that worked flawlessly the week before. For anyone whose gaming life centers on live service competitive titles rather than single-player or older multiplayer games, This one category of problem is often enough on its own to send them straight back to Windows, no matter how much they liked everything else about the switch. The second major pullback toward Windows comes from professional, creative, and business software that simply does not have a native Linux build and shows no public sign of getting one. Adobe has never shipped Photoshop, Premiere Pro, After Effects, or Illustrator for Linux. Open source alternatives like GIMP, Kdenlive, and DaVinci Resolve, which does have an official Linux version, have closed a lot of the gap over the years. And for hobbyists, they are often genuinely good enough. But for working professionals whose income depends on matching a specific client's workflow, opening files exactly the way a collaborator expects, or relying on a plugin ecosystem that only exists on Windows or Mac OS, good enough is not the bar that matters. The bar is identical, and outside of a narrow set of use cases, Linux cannot clear it yet. The same pattern shows up in less glamorous corners too. Certain accounting platforms, CAD and engineering tools, niche industry-specific applications, and the VPN clients that IT departments mandate for remote work, all built with Windows as the only assumption their developers ever made. Running them through compatibility layers like Wine sometimes works with annoying quirks, and sometimes does not work at all, and very few professionals are willing to bet a client deadline on sometimes. Even when a Linux-based tool can technically open the same project file, subtle differences in font rendering, color management, or plugin support can introduce inconsistencies that only surface after a client has already signed off on a draft, which is exactly the kind of risk a freelancer working against a deadline cannot afford to discover the hard way. Then there's a smaller, scrappier set of hardware annoyances that rarely make headlines, but quietly push a noticeable number of switchers back. NVIDIA's proprietary graphics drivers, which the majority of gaming and creative laptops rely on, have a long history of friction with Linux's increasingly Wayland-based display systems, showing up as screen tearing, multi-monodo, R-flicker, or a laptop that does not wake up properly from sleep. Bluetooth audio is its own minor nightmare on certain hardware combinations, with some users stuck on lower quality audio codecs or dealing with stuttering that a simple driver update would fix instantly on Windows, but takes a forum thread and 3 terminal commands to work around on Linux: fingerprint readers, specific webcam drivers, and laptop-specific power. Profiles that ship pre-configured on Windows often need to be tracked down and configured by hand. None of this is unsolvable, and for someone who enjoys tinkering, it is a fun Saturday project. For someone who just wants their laptop to behave the same way it did the day before, running into 2 or 3 of these issues in the first month is often the exact moment they decide the switch is not worth the ongoing maintenance. Underneath every one of those individual issues sits a more general trade-off that decides a lot of these outcomes before any specific app or driver ever comes into the picture. Windows, for all its faults, is a single product made by one company with one official support channel and a broadly consistent experience across every machine that runs it. Linux is dozens of actively maintained distributions, each with its own package manager, its own default desktop layout, and its own community offering. Sometimes conflicting advice. That variety is a genuine strength for people who want granular control over every layer of their system. It is a genuine source of decision fatigue for people who just wanted to install one thing and get back to work. Several accounts from people running 30-day Linux trials describe almost the same arc. A clean, ad-free, fast-feeling first week, followed by a slow accumulation of small terminal command fixes for things that used to be a single click on Windows, ending in a decision either to keep going because the trade-off still feels worth it, or to roll back because the cumulative time cost quietly outweighed the benefit, which way that lands has very little to do with intelligence or technical skill, and a lot to do with how much spare patience someone has for treating small computer problems as a hobby rather than as an interruption to their day. Put all of this together, and the 2 groups stop looking random at all. The people who stay on Linux tend to be doing general-purpose computing on hardware Windows 11 has effectively abandoned. They were already unhappy with the account requirements, the ads, and the telemetry creeping through every Windows update, and they either do not play heavily anti-cheat protected competitive games, or they have made peace with keeping those specific titles on a separate machine or console. The people who quietly reinstall Windows tend to be defined by one hard dependency rather than broad dissatisfaction. A competitive game with kernel-level anti-cheat, a piece of professional software with no real Linux equivalent, a specific peripheral that refuses to cooperate, or simply a tolerance for troubleshooting that ran out faster than expected. There's a third group that this whole framing usually misses, and it might be the fastest growing of all 3, the dual booters and the hedgers. These are people running Linux as their daily driver for browsing, work, and general use, while keeping a Windows partition, a separate gaming PC, or synced cloud backup specifically for the handful of things Linux still cannot do for them. They are not really staying or going back in the dramatic all-or-nothing sense comment sections love to argue about. They have simply stopped treating the operating system as an identity and started treating it as a tool, reaching for whichever one solves the problem actually in front of them. Stora. G is cheap. Dual boot setups have gotten genuinely easy to configure, and that middle path is quietly absorbing a lot of the people who, 5 years ago, would have made one dramatic and irreversible switch in either direction. If you read all of that and land on the "I should probably try this" side, the practical advice from people who have already made the jump is fairly consistent. Linux Mint remains the default recommendation for anyone coming straight from Windows because its layout is deliberately familiar and it asks almost nothing of you on day one. Anyone leaning toward gaming specifically tends to get pointed toward a gaming-focused distribution such as Bazite, which ships Proton GPU drivers and Steam pre-configured instead of leaving you to assemble all of it by hand. Fedora and Ubuntu sit a notch higher on the technical comfort scale, but offer strong long-term software support once you're past the first month. None of these choices are permanent or risk-free, which is exactly why almost every experienced switcher recommends dual booting or keeping a spare drive with the old Windows install intact for the first few weeks, rather than wiping everything in one excited afternoon. The goal is not finding the objectively best distribution. It is finding the one that gets you through the first month without giving you a reason to quit before you have actually tested whether the specific things you personally care about even work. So here is the checklist that matters more than any abstract argument about which operating system is better. If most of your time goes to browsing, streaming Office, work and casual or single-player games, and especially if your current PC cannot officially run Windows 11 anyway, Linux in 2026 is a genuinely solid, low-risk choice, and the privacy and ad-free experience alone might be worth the move on its own. If your gaming time is dominated by live service competitive titles built around kernel-level anti-cheat, check a Linux compatibility tracker before you wipe anything, because that single category of software has sent more people back to Windows than every other complaint in this video combined. If your income depends on Adobe's Creative Suite, specific CAD or accounting software, or company-mandated VPN client, plan around dual boot or a separate machine rather than betting. Your entire workflow on a clean break you cannot easily undo. And if you know yourself well enough to admit you have very little patience for typing terminal commands to fix things that used to just work, that is not a character flaw. It is useful self-knowledge, and it might mean Windows, annoying defaults and all, is still the lower stress choice for you right now. None of this is fixed in place. Linux gaming compatibility keeps climbing every year, and there's a real chance some of today's anti-cheat blockers get partially solved the same way Easy Anti-Cheat and BattleEye already have for a subset of titles. Valve has publicly treated the anti-cheat gap as a priority tied to its broader hardware ambitions, which means this specific blocker, more than almost anything else on this list, has a realistic shot at shrinking over the next couple of years, rather than staying fixed in place. Equally, nothing guarantees Microsoft's defaults get less aggressive from here rather than more. The honest answer to who is staying and who is going back is not a fixed tribe you join for life. It is a running tally of which operating its system currently causes you less friction for the specific things you do every single day. And that tally is worth rechecking every year or two, rather than deciding once and never looking again. If you have made the jump in either direction this year, drop a comment with what actually tipped the decision for you. Because the real stories underneath videos like this one are usually more useful than any top 10 list could be. And if this kind of breakdown was helpful, hit like and subscribe, because there is a lot more ground to cover on exactly where Linux gaming compatibility stands title by title, and exactly which Windows 11 settings are worth fixing the moment you decide you are staying put.